Omar Rashid thought he had erased every trace of his past. The woman he once loved, the promises he broke, the life he destroyed with a single cruel decision. In his world of private jets and billion-dollar mergers, memories were luxuries he couldn't afford. But when the hospital doors opened that day and she walked in wearing a white coat with his life literally in her hands, everything he thought he knew about power, pride, and second chances crumbled beneath the weight of 3 decades of regret. She wasn't the broken woman he had cast aside. She was Dr. Fatima Okafor, one of the most renowned cardiac surgeons in Europe. And the man whose heart she was about to operate on had no idea that she was the same woman whose heart he had shattered 30 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Swiss Alps in shades of gold and crimson as Omar Rashid's private helicopter descended toward the exclusive Clinique Mont-Blanc. At 62, Omar still commanded rooms with his presence. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed even in his current state of medical distress, his dark eyes holding the same intensity that had built an empire spanning from the oil fields of Kuwait to the tech corridors of Silicon Valley. But today, those eyes held something else: fear. The chest pains had started 3 weeks ago during a board meeting in London. Sharp, radiating sensations that made his left arm tingle and his breathing shallow. He'd dismissed it initially. Stress, too. Much caffeine, the weight of managing a fortune worth $12 billion. Men like Omar Rashid didn't have time for weakness. They certainly didn't have time for heart attacks. Yet here he was, clutching his chest as his personal physician. Dr. Hassan helped him from the helicopter onto the pristine grounds of Switzerland's most exclusive cardiac facility. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had spent his life hardening his heart against emotion now faced the very real possibility that his physical heart might fail him. "Mr. Rashid," Dr. Hassan said gently, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's fading rotors. "The tests from London were conclusive. You need surgery, and you need it soon. The blockage is severe. 90% occlusion of your left anterior descending artery. Without intervention." Omar waved him silent. He understood the implications. In his world, you learned to read between the lines, to understand what people weren't saying as much as what they were. Death was a competitor he had never faced before, and like all his business rivals, he had no intention of losing to it. The clinic itself was a masterpiece of modern architecture and medical excellence, nestled against the dramatic backdrop of Mont-Blanc. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of snow-capped peaks, while the interior combined cutting-edge medical technology with the warmth and luxury of a 5-star resort. This was where royalty came to heal, where titans of industry faced their mortality in surroundings that rivaled their own palaces. Omar had chosen this place not just for its discretion and excellence, but because it was far from the prying eyes of the media and the whispered conversations of his business associates. A heart attack was weakness, and weakness was something Omar Rashid had never been able to afford. As they wheeled him through the pristine corridors, Omar's mind wandered to the empire he had built. Rashid Holdings had tentacles reaching into every corner of the global economy: oil refineries in the Middle East, luxury hotels across Europe, technology startups in California, and mining operations in 3 continents. He had started with nothing but a sharp mind and an uncompromising will, building his fortune through calculated risks and the ability to make hard decisions that others couldn't stomach. But there had been casualties along the way. Partnerships dissolved, competitors crushed, and personal relationships sacrificed on the altar of ambition. Omar had learned early that sentiment was the enemy of success, that emotional attachments were liabilities that could destroy everything he worked to build. The irony of his current situation wasn't lost on him. A man who had spent decades avoiding emotional vulnerability now lay vulnerable in a hospital bed, his carefully constructed world reduced to the rhythm of machines monitoring his vital signs. "Sir," the admitting nurse said softly, "we'll need to prepare you for surgery. The surgical team is being assembled now. You're fortunate. Dr. Okafor is available. She's one of the most skilled cardiac surgeons in the world. She's performed over 3,000 heart surgeries with a success rate that's virtually unmatched." Omar nodded absently, his thoughts elsewhere. He had researched the clinic extensively before agreeing to come here. Dr. Fatima Okafor was indeed legendary in her field, a pioneering surgeon who had developed revolutionary techniques for complex cardiac procedures. Her patient list read like a who's who of European nobility and international celebrities. She was exactly the kind of surgeon a man of his stature required. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that Dr. Fatima Okafor had once been simply Fatima, a young woman whose life he had destroyed with callous precision. 3 decades earlier, as the medical team prepared him for surgery, Omar's thoughts drifted to a time he had worked hard to forget. 30 years ago, he had been a different man, younger, perhaps less calculating, certainly more susceptible to the softer emotions he had since trained himself to suppress. He had been building his first major business venture, a construction company that would eventually become the foundation of his empire. It was during those early days that she had entered his life like a force of nature. Beautiful, intelligent, with a laugh that could light up the darkest room, and a spirit that refused to be dimmed by the casual racism and cultural barriers they faced. She'd been studying medicine then, one of the few African women in her program, brilliant and determined to make a difference in the world. For a brief, dangerous moment, Omar had allowed himself to believe that love could coexist with ambition, that he could build an empire and keep the woman who had captured his heart. But his family had other plans. Traditional expectations, cultural pressures, and the iron will of a patriarch who viewed Omar's relationship as a threat to the family's reputation and business prospects. The choice had been presented to him in stark terms: his inheritance, his family's support, his very identity within the community he had been born into, or her. Choose the empire or choose love, but understand that you cannot have both. Omar had made his choice. He had chosen power over love, tradition over happiness, and in doing so had carved out the part of himself capable of such emotions. The young man who had once held her close and whispered promises of forever had died that day, replaced by the calculating businessman who now lay in this Swiss hospital bed. He had told himself it was the practical choice, the rational decision. Love was temporary, but power endured. Relationships could be replaced, but family legacy and business empire were permanent. He had convinced himself that he had made the right choice, that the pain would fade, that the memories would lose their sharp edges with time. But lying there in the quiet of the hospital room, with the alpine peaks visible through the window and the steady beep of heart monitors as his soundtrack, Omar realized that some wounds never truly heal. They simply get buried beneath layers of success and self-deception, waiting for moments of vulnerability to resurface with all their original intensity. The nurse returned with a clipboard of forms and consent documents. "Dr. Okafor will be in shortly to discuss the procedure with you," she said efficiently. She likes to meet with her patients personally before surgery. It's part of her approach. She believes the connection between surgeon and patient is crucial. For optimal outcomes, Omar signed the papers with his characteristic bold signature, the same signature that had sealed billion-dollar deals and changed the course of industries. But his hand trembled slightly whether from his medical condition or some deeper premonition he couldn't say. As he settled back into the hospital bed, Omar Rashid had no idea that in a few moments his carefully constructed world would collide with a past he thought he had successfully buried. The woman he had cast aside, the life he had destroyed, the love he had sacrificed. It was all about to walk through that door in the form of the very person who now held his life in her hands. The wheel of fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony that even a billionaire's fortune couldn't buy his way out of. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The soft knock on the door came at exactly 3:47 p.m. Omar had been watching the digital clock on the bedside monitor, his anxiety building with each passing minute. He had faced hostile takeovers, navigated international crises, and stared down some of the most powerful men in the world across boardroom tables. But something about this impending meeting with his surgeon felt different. A weight in his chest that had nothing to do with his cardiac condition. "Come in," he called, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect in every corner of the globe. The door opened slowly, and time seemed to suspend itself in that sterile hospital room. A woman in pristine white scrubs entered, her movements graceful and confident. She carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to holding lives. In her hands, someone who had earned her place through decades of dedication and excellence. Dr. Fatima Okafor was 57 now, but the years had been kind to her in ways that Omar couldn't have imagined. Her skin, still rich and radiant, showed the wisdom of experience rather than the wear of hardship. Her hair, now silver-streaked and pulled back in a professional bun, framed a face that had gained strength and character with age. She wore thin-rimmed glasses that gave her an air of scholarly authority, and her white coat bore the insignia of multiple medical honors and certifications, but it was her eyes that stopped Omar's breath. Those same dark, intelligent eyes that had once looked at him with love and trust, that had pleaded with him not to abandon their marriage, that had finally hardened with the realization that she meant less to him than his family's approval and business prospects. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a chasm spanning 3 decades of separation, success, and unspoken pain. The only sounds were the gentle hum of medical equipment and the distant murmur of the alpine wind against the windows. Fatima's expression remained professionally composed, but Omar caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible pause as she processed the sight of him. She had known, of course. The moment she had seen his name on the surgical schedule, she had known this day would come. But knowing and experiencing were 2 entirely different things. "Mr. Rashid," she said finally, her voice steady and clinical, "I am Dr. Okafor. I'll be performing your cardiac surgery." The formal address hit Omar like a physical blow. Once she had called him Habibti, my love. Once her voice had carried warmth and affection when she spoke his name. Now he was simply another patient, another case file, another life too. Save with professional detachment. "Fatima," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. She raised her hand slightly, a gesture that stopped him from continuing. "Dr. Okafor," she corrected firmly. "We need to discuss your procedure, Mr. Rashid. Time is of the essence with your condition." She moved to the chair beside his bed with practiced efficiency, pulling out a tablet and stylus. Her movements were precise, controlled, bearing no trace of the young woman who had once danced in his arms to Arabic music in their small apartment, who had laughed at his jokes and dreamed with him about the future they would build together. "Your angiogram shows a critical blockage in your left anterior descending artery," she began, her tone purely professional. "The occlusion is approximately 92%, which puts you at immediate risk for a massive myocardial infarction. We need to perform emergency bypass surgery within the next 6 hours. Omar found himself studying her face as she spoke, searching for any crack in her professional facade. He saw the way her fingers gripped the stylus just a fraction too tightly, the slight tension in her jaw that suggested this conversation was costing her more than she was willing to reveal. The procedure will require us to harvest vessels from your leg to create grafts around the blocked arteries, she continued, pulling up detailed cardiac images on her tablet. It's a complex surgery, but one I've performed successfully over 3,000 times. The success rate is 97.4% when performed within the optimal time window. And the risks? Omar asked, his business mind automatically seeking the complete picture. Every surgery carries risks, Fatima replied, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time since entering the room. Bleeding, infection, stroke, or in rare cases, death. But the alternative, doing nothing, carries a 100% mortality rate within the next few days. The weight of those words settled between them. Omar, who had built an empire on calculated risks, now faced the ultimate gamble. With stakes he couldn't negotiate or control, and the person holding his life in her hands was the woman whose life he had destroyed 3 decades earlier. I need to ask you some questions about your medical history, Fatima said, her stylus poised over the tablet. Any previous heart conditions, family history of cardiac disease, current medications? As Omar answered her questions, his mind wandered to the cruel irony of their situation. He remembered the day he had told her their marriage was over, the day he had chosen his family's approval and business prospects over their love. She had been in her final year of medical school then, brilliant and determined, but still dependent on his financial support to complete her education. He had withdrawn that support along with his love, leaving her to face not just the emotional devastation of abandonment, but the practical reality of completing her medical degree without resources. He had told himself it was a clean break, that she would move on, find someone more suitable, build a different life. Now, seeing her in her white coat, surrounded by the trappings of professional success and expertise, Omar realized how spectacularly he had underestimated her. She hadn't just survived his abandonment, she had thrived, becoming one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the world. The woman he had left behind as broken and dependent had transformed herself into someone who now held his very life in her skilled hands. Mr. Rashid, Fatima said, noting his distraction, I need you to focus. These questions are important for your safety during surgery. Of course, Omar replied, pulling his attention back to the present. I'm sorry, I was just thinking about the irony of our situation. Fatima's expression didn't change, but he saw her grip tighten slightly on the stylus. I'm not sure what you mean. This is a straightforward medical consultation between a surgeon and her patient. Is it? Omar asked quietly. Because 30 years ago, you were my wife, and 30 years ago is irrelevant to your current medical needs, Fatima interrupted, her voice sharp with professional authority. What matters now is that you have a life-threatening condition that requires immediate surgical intervention. My personal history with any patient is not a factor in my medical decision-making. But even as she spoke, Omar could see the cost of maintaining that professional detachment, the slight tremor in her hands as she made notes, the way she avoided direct eye contact, the tension in her shoulders that spoke of old wounds carefully contained but never fully healed. Will you be able to? Omar began, then stopped himself. He had been about to ask if she could operate on him objectively, but realized how that would sound, as if he doubted her professionalism, as if he believed her capable of letting personal feelings interfere with her medical judgment. Will I be able to what, Mr. Rashid? Fatima asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. Will you be able to save my life? he asked instead, though they both knew that wasn't his original question. Fatima stood, closing her tablet with a decisive snap. "Mr. Rashid, I have dedicated my entire career to saving lives. I have performed surgery on dictators who have committed genocide, on criminals who have destroyed families, on people who have done unspeakable things. I have never once allowed personal feelings to influence my medical judgment, and I'm not about to start now." She moved toward the door, then paused, her hand on the handle. "The surgery is scheduled for 7 p.m. A nurse will be in shortly to begin your preoperative preparation. I suggest you spend the next few hours making peace with whatever you need to make peace with." "Fatima, wait," Omar called out, his voice breaking slightly. She turned back, and for just a moment her professional mask slipped. Omar saw the pain there, the anger, the hurt that 3 decades hadn't been able to fully heal. But he also saw something else, a strength and dignity that took his breath away. "You left me with nothing," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No money, no support, no explanation beyond your family's disapproval. I was 3 months pregnant, Omar, and you walked away like I was nothing more than a business deal gone bad." The words hit Omar like a physical blow. Pregnant. She had been pregnant, and he had never known. The implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had abandoned not just his wife, but his unborn child. "I didn't know," he whispered, his face pale with shock. "No," Fatima agreed, her voice growing stronger. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask. You didn't know because you were too busy protecting your precious reputation to care about the collateral damage you left behind." She straightened, her professional composure reasserting itself. "But that was 30 years ago, Mr. Rashid. Today I am Dr. Okafor, and you are my patient. In 3 hours I will open your chest and repair your heart, because that is what I do. I save lives, regardless of who those lives belong to." With that, she left the room, leaving Omar alone with the weight of revelations that threatened to stop his already damaged heart. He had thought he was facing mortality, but now he realized he was facing something far more terrifying, the truth about the man he had chosen to become and the price others had paid for his choices. As the alpine sun began to set outside his window, Omar Rashid found himself confronting not just his own mortality, but the ghost of the man he might have been if he had made different choices 30 years ago, and the woman who would soon hold. His life in her hands was living proof of the strength and grace he had been too blind to see when it had been freely offered to him. The hours that followed were the longest of Omar's life, as nurses prepared him for surgery, shaving his chest, inserting IV lines, explaining pre-operative procedures. His mind reeled with the devastating revelation that had shattered his understanding of the past. A child. He had walked away from a pregnant woman, leaving her to face motherhood alone, while he built his empire on the foundation of that abandonment. The sedatives they gave him did nothing to quiet the storm in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Fatima as she had been 30 years ago, young, radiant, full of dreams and trust. He remembered the last conversation they'd had, the coldness in his voice as he told her their marriage was a mistake, that his family would never accept her, that she needed to understand her place in his world. She had stood there in their small apartment, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach in a gesture he now understood with crushing clarity. She had been protecting their child even then, and he had been too blinded by ambition and family pressure to see what was right in front of him. A soft knock interrupted his tortured thoughts. Dr. Hassan entered, his usually composed face showing concern that went beyond professional duty. "Omar," he said quietly, using his patient's first name in the informal way they had developed over their 15-year relationship. "I've spoken with Dr. Okafor about your surgery. She's exceptional. You couldn't be in better hands." Omar turned toward his longtime physician and friend. "Hassan, I need to ask you something, and I need complete honesty." Dr. Hassan pulled up a chair, sensing the gravity in Omar's tone. "Of course. In your professional opinion, could personal feelings, hatred, resentment, affect a surgeon's performance? Could they compromise patient care?" Hassan studied Omar's face carefully. "Are you asking if Dr. Okafor might deliberately harm you during surgery?" The directness of the question hit Omar like a slap. I don't know what I'm asking. Omar, I've known you for 15 years. You're one of the most calculating men I've ever met. You don't ask questions without reason." Hassan leaned forward. "What history do you have with Dr. Okafor?" Omar closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 decades of silence. "She was my wife. 30 years ago I left her. My family demanded it, and I chose them over her. I found out today that she was pregnant when I abandoned her." The silence that followed was deafening. Hassan's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, understanding, and finally something that looked like disappointment. "My God, Omar," Hassan whispered. "You were married to Fatima Okafor? You know her reputation. Know it? She's legendary in cardiac surgery. Her techniques have revolutionized the field. She saved thousands of lives, trained hundreds of surgeons." Hassan paused, studying Omar with new eyes. "The woman you abandoned became one of the most respected doctors in the world." The irony wasn't lost on Omar. While he had built financial wealth, she had built something far more valuable, a legacy of healing, of lives saved, of contributions to humanity that no amount of money could match. "But to answer your question," Hassan continued, "Fatima Okafor is known for her absolute dedication to the Hippocratic Oath. There are stories of her operating on war criminals, on people who had destroyed entire communities. She believes that once someone becomes her patient, nothing else matters except saving their life." Omar absorbed this information, finding both comfort and additional guilt in it. She would save him not because she forgave him, but because she was too good a person to let personal history interfere with her sacred duty as a physician. "There's something else you should know," Hassan said quietly. "Before I came in here, I did some research. After you left her, she didn't just complete medical school. She excelled. She graduated top of her class, completed her residency at Johns Hopkins, specialized in cardiac surgery at Harvard. She's written textbooks, pioneered surgical techniques, established free clinics in underserved communities." Each accomplishment Hassan listed felt like another weight on Omar's chest. While he had been accumulating wealth and power, she had been saving lives and healing the world. Was there a child?" Omar asked, his voice barely audible. Hassan was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, Omar. Her personal life is very private. What I do know is that she's never married, has dedicated her entire life to medicine. Whatever happened after you left her, she channeled it into becoming extraordinary. The implications hung heavy in the air. Had she lost the baby? Raised the child alone? Given it up for adoption? Each possibility carried its own devastating weight of responsibility and regret. Another knock on the door interrupted their conversation. A young resident entered, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Rashid, I'm Dr. Chen. I'll be assisting Dr. Okafor in your surgery. I need to go over the procedure with you one final time and get your consent." As Dr. Chen explained the surgical process, the incisions, the bypasses, the risks and recovery timeline, Omar found himself thinking about trust. In a few hours, he would be unconscious and completely vulnerable, his life dependent on the skill and judgment of the woman he had wronged more deeply than he'd ever imagined. "Dr. Chen," Omar interrupted, "in your experience working with Dr. Okafor, how does she handle difficult cases?" The young resident's face lit up with admiration. "Dr. Okafor is incredible. I've seen her operate for 18 hours straight to save a patient everyone else had given up on. She once told me that every person who comes to her operating table is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's hope. She says that when she holds a human heart in her hands, nothing else in the world matters except making it beat again. The words struck Omar with profound force. Someone's child, someone's parent. He thought about the child Fatima had been carrying, about how his abandonment had shaped not just her life, but potentially the life of his own offspring. "Doctor," Omar said quietly, "what would you do if you discovered that a patient you were about to operate on had once caused you tremendous personal pain?" Dr. Chen considered the question seriously. "I think that's why Dr. Okafor is so respected. She separates the person from the patient. In the operating room, you're not a billionaire or a stranger or someone with a complicated history. You're a human being with a heart that needs fixing, and that's all that matters to her." After Dr. Chen left, Omar lay in the gathering darkness of the alpine evening, watching lights twinkle in the valley below. Somewhere in this building, Fatima was preparing to save his life. She was reviewing his case files, studying his scans, planning the precise movements that would determine whether he lived or died. The magnitude of his situation overwhelmed him. The woman he had abandoned, left pregnant and alone, had become the very person capable of giving him back his life. She had transformed her pain into purpose, her abandonment into a calling to heal others. For the first time in decades, Omar found himself praying, not to any specific deity, but to the universe itself, asking for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve, and for a chance to somehow make amends for the irreparable damage he had caused. As the pre-operative medications began to take effect, making his thoughts hazy and his body heavy, Omar's last conscious thought was a question that would haunt him into the depths of anesthesia. In a few hours, when Fatima held his damaged heart in her skilled hands, would she see the organ that needed healing, or would she see the man who had broken her heart 30 years ago? The answer, he realized, lay entirely in the character of the extraordinary woman he had been too foolish to appreciate when he'd had the chance. The operating theatre at Clinique Mont-Blanc was a cathedral of modern medicine, bathed in brilliant white light, equipped with the most advanced cardiac surgical technology money could buy. It represented the pinnacle of human achievement in the art of healing. At 7:15 p.m., as the Swiss Alps stood silhouetted against the dying light outside, this sterile sanctuary would become the stage for a confrontation 30 years in the making. Dr. Fatima Okafor stood at the scrub station, her movements methodical and precise as she prepared for surgery. The ritual of scrubbing had always been meditative for her. The careful cleaning of each finger, the systematic washing that removed not just germs, but also the outside world, leaving only the surgeon and the sacred duty ahead. Tonight, however, the meditation was elusive. Despite her decades of experience, despite her legendary composure under pressure, Fatima found her mind wandering to memories she had long ago buried beneath layers of professional success and personal healing. She thought about the young woman she had been 30 years ago, idealistic, trusting, believing that love could conquer cultural barriers and family expectations. That woman had died the day Omar walked away, leaving behind someone harder, more focused, but also infinitely more capable. The pain of abandonment had forged her into steel, and that steel had saved thousands of lives. Dr. Okafor. The voice belonged to Dr. Chen, who had appeared beside her at the scrub station. The patient is under anesthesia and prepped. His vitals are stable, but there's been a complication. Fatima's professional instincts immediately engaged. What kind of complication? The angiogram showed additional blockages we missed in the initial scans. It's not just the LAD, there's significant stenosis in the right coronary artery and the circumflex. We're looking at a triple bypass, possibly quadruple. The news hit Fatima with professional understanding and personal irony. Omar's condition was worse than they had thought, meaning the surgery would be longer, more complex, more dangerous. She would need to spend hours working on his heart, her hands literally inside his chest, keeping him alive through sheer skill and determination. His family? Fatima asked as they moved toward the operating room. No family present, just his personal physician, Dr. Hassan, in the waiting area. Apparently, Mr. Rashid is estranged from his relatives. The information didn't surprise Fatima. The family that had demanded Omar choose between them and his wife had likely continued to be a source of isolation and emotional poverty in his life. Power and wealth, she had learned, often came at the cost of genuine human connection. As they entered the operating theater, Fatima felt the familiar transformation that occurred every time she crossed that threshold. Personal feelings, memories, and emotions all receded as Dr. Okafor, cardiac surgeon, took complete control. This was her domain, her sanctuary, the place where nothing mattered except the sacred trust between surgeon and patient. Omar lay unconscious on the table, his chest exposed and marked with surgical guidelines. Under the bright lights, with monitors displaying his vital signs in real time, he looked vulnerable, in a way Fatima had never seen before. Gone was the commanding presence, the steel in his eyes, the aura of power that had both attracted and ultimately disappointed her decades ago. Beginning thoracotomy, Fatima announced to the surgical team as she made the first incision. Her voice was steady, professional, betraying none of the emotional complexity churning beneath the surface. The surgery began with the careful precision that had made Fatima legendary in her field. Each movement was calculated, purposeful, the result of thousands of hours of training and experience. As she opened Omar's chest and exposed his heart, she found herself looking at the organ that had once beaten for her, that had once raced when she entered a room, that had ultimately chosen ambition over love. Significant calcification in all. 3 vessels, she reported to the team. We'll need to harvest vessels from both legs and the internal mammary artery. Dr. Chen, begin preparing the grafts. As the surgery progressed, Fatima fell into the rhythm that had sustained her through countless operations. Her hands moved with practiced grace, each suture perfect, each decision made with the accumulated wisdom of a career dedicated to healing. Around her, the surgical team worked in synchronized harmony, a ballet of medical expertise focused on the singular goal of preserving life. But as she worked, memories began to surface despite her best efforts to suppress them. The feel of Omar's heart beneath her hands brought back visceral recollections of when that same heart had beaten against her chest as they danced in their small apartment, when she had felt it racing as he made love to her, when it had been the physical manifestation of emotions he claimed to feel but ultimately chose to abandon. "Naja, pressure dropping," announced the anesthesiologist. "I'm seeing some arrhythmias." Fatima's focus sharpened instantly. This was the moment that separated good surgeons from great ones, when complications arose and split-second decisions determined life or death. She adjusted her technique, working faster but with no loss of precision. Starting the first anastomosis, she announced, beginning the delicate process of connecting the graft vessels to restore blood flow around the blocked arteries. This was the most critical part of the procedure, requiring steady hands and unwavering concentration. As she worked, Fatima found herself thinking about the child she had lost. She had never told anyone about the miscarriage that occurred 3 months after Omar left her. Not Dr. Hassan, not her colleagues, not even her closest friends. The stress of abandonment, the financial pressure of completing medical school alone, the emotional devastation of betrayal had all contributed to the loss of the baby that might have been their child. She had grieved that loss in silence, channeling her pain into her studies, transforming her sorrow into determination. Every life she saved became, in some small way, a memorial to the life that had been lost. Every heart she repaired was an act of defiance against the cruelty that had shaped her destiny. Second graft complete, Dr. Chen reported. Excellent. Anastomosis, Dr. Okafor. Fatima nodded, continuing her work. She was now literally holding Omar's heart in her hands, feeling its rhythm, sensing its struggle to maintain life. The irony was not lost on her. The man who had broken her heart now depended entirely on her skill to keep his own heart beating. Dr. Okafor, the perfusionist called out, "We're seeing some irregularities in the bypass circuit. How much longer do you estimate?" 45 minutes for the remaining grafts, Fatima replied without hesitation. Time was critical in cardiac surgery. Too long on the heart-lung machine increased the risk of complications exponentially. As she began the third bypass, Fatima allowed herself to consider the man whose life hung in the balance. Omar had built an empire, accumulated vast wealth, wielded tremendous power. But lying here, unconscious and dependent on machines and medical expertise, he was simply another human being whose heart needed fixing. The young woman he had abandoned might have wished him harm, might have fantasized about revenge. But the doctor she had become understood that healing was not about worthiness, it was about humanity. Omar's heart deserved to beat not because he was a good man, but because he was a human being, and human life had inherent value regardless of the choices that had led to this moment. Third graft complete, she announced. Beginning the final. Anastomosis. The last bypass was always the most challenging. Hands growing tired, concentration tested by hours of intense focus, the pressure of completing the surgery successfully weighing on every movement. But Fatima had performed this procedure over 3,000 times, and muscle memory guided her through the final, critical connections. "Coming off bypass," she called out, as the heart-lung machine was gradually shut down and Omar's heart was asked to resume its natural function. This was the moment of truth. Would the grafts hold? Would the heart respond? Would the surgery save the life it was intended to preserve? The monitors showed Omar's heart rhythm stabilizing, the new grafts providing the blood flow his damaged arteries had been unable to deliver. His pressure normalized, his oxygen saturation improved, and the various alarms that had been sounding throughout the surgery finally fell silent. "Beautiful work, Dr. Okafor," Dr. Chen said with genuine admiration. "Textbook triple bypass." As Fatima began the process of closing Omar's chest, she reflected on the profound irony of the last 4.5 hours. She had spent more intimate time with Omar in this operating room than she had in the final months of their marriage. She had touched his heart more gently as his surgeon than he had ever touched hers as her husband. "Surgery complete," she announced. To the team, "Excellent work, everyone. Let's get him to recovery." As the surgical team prepared to transfer Omar to the cardiac intensive care unit, Fatima stepped back and looked at her work. The man who had abandoned her 30 years ago would live. The heart that had chosen ambition over love would beat for many more years, and the woman he had left broken and pregnant would be the reason he survived to see another day. Walking out of the operating theatre, Fatima felt a strange sense of completion. She had not just saved a life, she had closed a circle that had been open for 3 decades. Whatever Omar Rashid had done to her in the past, whatever pain he had caused, whatever damage he had inflicted, she had answered with the highest expression of her humanity, the preservation of life. In the recovery room, as machines monitored Omar's vital signs and medications slowly brought him back to consciousness, Fatima finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what had just occurred. She had held the heart of the man who broke hers, and she had chosen to heal rather than harm, to forgive rather than seek revenge, to demonstrate the very grace and strength that he had been too blind to see in her 30 years ago. The surgery was over, but for both Omar and Fatima, the real healing was just beginning. Consciousness returned to Omar Rashid like dawn breaking over the mountains, slowly, then all at once. The first sensation was pain, a deep ache across his chest that felt like his ribs had been pried apart and reassembled. The second was the steady beeping of monitors, a mechanical symphony that told him he was alive. The third was the antiseptic smell of the cardiac intensive care unit, a sterile sanctuary where the boundary between life and death was measured in heartbeats. His eyes opened to find the alpine morning light filtering through floor to ceiling, windows painting the recovery room in soft gold. The view of Mont Blanc seemed impossibly pristine from his bed, a reminder that while he had been unconscious, fighting for his life in an operating theatre, the world had continued its ancient rhythms unchanged. Mr. Rashid, the voice belonged to a nurse whose name tag read Sophie. She appeared at his bedside with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to shepherding the powerful and wealthy through their most vulnerable moments. "How are you feeling?" Omar tried to speak, but found his throat raw from the breathing tube. Sophie anticipated his need, offering him ice chips and adjusting his bed to a more comfortable position. "The surgery was successful," she continued, checking the various monitors connected to his body. "Dr. Okafor performed a triple bypass. You're going to make a full recovery, but it will take time." Dr. Okafor. Even in his post-surgical haze, the name carried weight that had nothing to do with medical credentials. Fatima had saved his life. The woman he had abandoned, left pregnant and alone, had spent 4.5 hours with her hands inside his chest, meticulously repairing the damage to his heart with a skill and dedication that spoke to everything he had been too blind to see in her 30 years ago. "Where is Dr. Okafor?" Omar managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's completing her rounds," Sophie replied. "She'll be in to check on you shortly. For now, you need to rest. Heart surgery is a trauma to the body, even when it saves your life." Rest, however, proved elusive. As the medications wore off and clarity returned, Omar found himself confronting not just his physical recovery, but the emotional aftermath of everything that had transpired. He was alive because of Fatima's skill, grace, and professional ethics. She had chosen to heal the man who had caused her immeasurable pain, demonstrating a level of forgiveness and humanity that shamed every decision he had made 30 years ago. Dr. Hassan appeared in the doorway, his face showing relief mixed with concern. "Omar, thank God. How do you feel?" "Like I've been hit by a truck that then backed up and hit me again," Omar replied, surprising himself with the attempt at humor. "But alive, very much alive." Hassan pulled up a chair, studying his friend and patient with the careful eye of a physician who had seen too many powerful men brought low by their own mortality. The surgery was extraordinary. Dr. Okafor's team said it was one of the most complex cases they'd handled, but she performed it flawlessly. "Hassan," Omar said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "After I left Fatima 30 years ago, what happened to her?" "Really happened?" Hassan was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with medical confidentiality and personal loyalty. Finally, he spoke. "Omar, I've been researching her background since yesterday. What I found is difficult." Omar steeled himself for whatever revelation was coming. "After you left her, she struggled, financially, emotionally, academically. She had to work 3 jobs to finish medical school, but that wasn't the worst of it." Hassan paused, clearly uncomfortable. "She lost the baby, Omar. Miscarriage at 6 months. The stress, the poverty, the emotional trauma, it all contributed. The words hit Omar like a physical blow, worse than any pain from his surgery. A child, his child, had been lost because of his abandonment. Not just the abstract concept of fatherhood he had been grappling with, but an actual baby that had died because he chose his family's approval over his responsibilities as a husband and father. "My God," Omar whispered, tears beginning to form. In his eyes, she was alone through all of that. Completely alone. But Omar, here's what's remarkable. She channeled that loss into something extraordinary. After she lost the baby, she became almost obsessively dedicated to saving other people's children. She pioneered pediatric cardiac techniques, established free clinics in underserved communities, trained hundreds of surgeons in developing countries. Hassan leaned forward, his voice intense. Every year on the anniversary of her miscarriage, she performs pro bono surgeries on children whose families can't afford cardiac care. She's saved over 2,000 children's lives in the past 3 decades. 2,000 children who are alive today because she transformed her grief into purpose. The magnitude of what Hassan was telling him overwhelmed Omar. While he had been building an empire of steel and concrete, accumulating wealth and power, Fatima had been building a legacy of healing that would echo through generations. Every child she saved carried forward the memory of the child they had lost together. She never married, Omar asked. Never. Dedicated her entire life to medicine. There have been relationships, but she's never allowed anyone close enough to risk that kind of pain again. The implications of that statement settled over Omar like a weight. His betrayal hadn't just cost Fatima their marriage and their child, it had shaped the entire trajectory of her emotional life, leaving her unable to trust love again. A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Chen entered, followed by Dr. Okafor herself. Fatima looked tired but composed, her white coat pristine despite having performed surgery the night before. She moved with the confident efficiency Omar remembered, but there was something else now, a gravitas that came from decades of holding life and death in her hands. "Mr. Rashid," she said formally, pulling up his chart on a tablet. "Your recovery is progressing well. Your heart rhythm is stable, the grafts are functioning perfectly, and your blood pressure has normalized." Omar watched her face as she spoke, searching for any trace of the young woman he had once known. She was there, buried beneath layers of professional competence and personal armor, but still there. "Dr. Okafor," Omar said quietly, "I want to thank you, not just for the surgery, but for everything." Fatima's eyes met his briefly, and he saw a flicker of something, pain, perhaps, or recognition of the weight his words carried. But her response remained clinical. "You're my patient, Mr. Rashid. Ensuring your recovery is my professional responsibility." "Is it?" Omar asked. "Because I think we both know this goes far beyond professional responsibility." Dr. Chen looked between them, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. Hassan remained silent, recognizing that this conversation needed to happen. Fatima set down her tablet, her composure finally showing the first crack. "Mr. Rashid, you're recovering from major cardiac surgery. This is not the time for personal discussions." "When is the time?" Omar asked, his voice growing stronger despite his physical weakness. "When I'm discharged. When I fly back to my empty mansion and pretend this never happened. When I go back to counting money while you continue. Saving lives? Your personal reflections are not my concern," Fatima replied, but Omar could hear the strain in her voice. "The baby," Omar said quietly, and the words seemed to suck all the air out of the room. "Hassan told me about the baby." Fatima went very still, her face pale. Dr. Chen looked confused, but Hassan gestured for him to remain silent. "You have no right," Fatima said, her voice barely controlled, "to bring that up now." I have every right, Omar replied, because it was my child too. My child who died because I was too much of a coward to stand up to my family, too selfish to honor my commitments, too proud to choose love over reputation. Fatima's professional mask was crumbling, revealing the pain that 30 years of success hadn't been able to fully heal. That child died because I was alone, stressed, working 3 jobs, trying to survive after you walked away like I was nothing. I know, Omar said, tears now flowing freely. And I will carry that responsibility for whatever time I have left. But Fatima, what you've done with that loss, what you've built from that pain, it's extraordinary. Don't, Fatima warned, her voice breaking. Don't try to find nobility in what happened. Don't try to make my survival into some kind of redemption for your choices. I'm not, Omar said. I'm trying to understand how someone could transform such devastation into so much healing. I'm trying to understand the kind of strength it takes to save the life of the person who caused you the deepest pain imaginable. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. Fatima stood frozen, decades of carefully controlled emotion threatening to overflow. You saved my life, Omar continued, when you had every reason to let me die. You chose healing over revenge, forgiveness over justice. You became everything I was too blind to see when I had the chance. Fatima closed her eyes, taking a deep breath that seemed to draw on reserves of strength built over 30 years of practicing medicine. When she opened them again, her professional composure had returned, but something fundamental had shifted. Your recovery will take 6 to 8 weeks, she said quietly. You'll need to make significant lifestyle changes. Diet, exercise, stress management. Dr. Hassan can coordinate your follow-up care. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. And Mr. Rashid, the child we lost would have been a daughter. I named her Amira. It means princess in Arabic. I thought you should know. With that, she left the room, leaving Omar to confront the full weight of everything he had lost and everything she had given him in return. As the alpine sun climbed higher in the sky, Omar Rashid began the long journey, not just of physical recovery, but of understanding what it meant to be forgiven by someone whose grace far exceeded anything he deserved. The days following Omar's surgery blurred together in a haze of recovery routines and soul-searching that cut deeper than any scalpel. Physical therapy sessions in the clinic's rehabilitation center forced him to confront his mortality with each labored step on the treadmill. Cardiac rehabilitation wasn't just about healing his heart, it was about rebuilding everything he thought. He knew about strength, power, and what truly mattered in life. It was during one of these sessions, as he struggled through breathing exercises that would have been effortless just a week ago, that Omar made a decision that would have shocked his former self. He instructed his assistant in Kuwait to begin liquidating portions of his business empire. "Sir," came the confused voice through his encrypted satellite phone. "Did you say liquidate? Which divisions?" "The arms manufacturing contracts," Omar said without hesitation. "The mining operations in Central Africa, the oil drilling rights in protected areas. Anything that causes more harm than good." There was a long pause. "Mr. Rashid, that represents approximately 30% of your holdings. Are you certain?" Omar looked out at the Swiss mountains, their peaks catching the morning light like a cathedral of natural beauty that made his corporate towers seem insignificant by comparison. "I'm certain. Convert the proceeds to liquid assets. I have plans for that money." What Omar didn't tell his assistant was that these plans had been forming since Dr. Hassan had told him about Fatima's charitable work. If she could transform personal devastation into healing for thousands, perhaps he could transform his ill-gotten wealth into something meaningful as well. But first, he needed to understand the full scope of what she had built. That afternoon, Omar asked Dr. Hassan to arrange something unusual, a video conference with the directors of several medical charities in Africa and the Middle East. What he discovered in those conversations shattered any remaining illusions about the comparative value of their respective life's work. Dr. Amara, from the Lagos Children's Hospital, spoke first. Dr. Okafor has personally trained 47 cardiac surgeons across West Africa. Without her intervention, we estimate that at least 8,000 children would have died from congenital heart defects in the past decade alone. Dr. Khalil from Jordan followed. She established our pediatric cardiac unit with her own funds, comes twice a year to perform surgeries we can't handle locally. Last year alone, she saved 96 children's lives here. The testimonials continued for over an hour. Fatima had quietly built a network of healing that spanned 3 continents, funded research into pediatric cardiac devices that made surgery possible in resource-limited settings, and trained an entire generation of surgeons who carried her techniques to the world's most underserved populations. While Omar had been accumulating zeros in his bank accounts, Fatima had been accumulating saved lives. That evening, as the alpine sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Omar received an unexpected visitor. Fatima appeared in his doorway, but this time she wasn't wearing her white coat. Instead, she wore a simple blue dress that reminded him painfully of the woman she had been 30 years ago. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual clinical distance. Omar nodded, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he looked in his hospital gown, connected to monitors, a pale shadow of the powerful man who had once commanded boardrooms across the globe. Fatima took the chair beside his bed, her movements careful and deliberate. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the mountains stood in silhouette against the darkening sky, eternal witnesses to human drama playing out in their shadow. "I owe you an explanation," Fatima said finally, her voice soft but clear. "About yesterday, about why I walked away when you mentioned Amira." Omar waited, sensing that this conversation would require patience and careful listening. "For 30 years, I've compartmentalized my life," she continued. "There was the doctor who saved lives, and there was the woman who lost everything. I kept them separate because mixing them would have been too painful to bear." She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had held his heart just days ago. "But when you said her name, when you acknowledged that she existed, that she mattered, it broke down walls I've spent decades building." "Tell me about her," Omar said gently. "Tell me about our daughter." Fatima was quiet for so long that Omar wondered if she would speak at all. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, she began. "She was perfect. At 6 months during the ultrasound, I could see her tiny face. She had your nose, my chin. The technician said she was developing beautifully." Fatima's voice caught slightly. "I used to talk to her every night, tell her about the life we would have together, about how her father would come back and we would be a family." Omar felt tears burning his eyes. "What happened?" "I was working at a restaurant until 3 a.m. The morning, studying until dawn, attending classes all day. I couldn't afford proper prenatal care, couldn't afford to rest. The stress, the physical exhaustion, the emotional trauma of your abandonment, my body couldn't sustain the pregnancy." She looked up at him then, and Omar saw not anger but infinite sadness in her eyes. "I was alone in a charity hospital when I lost her. No family, no friends, no husband to hold my hand. Just me and a social worker who had seen too many young women in similar situations. Fatima, No," she said firmly. "Let me finish. After I lost Amira, I wanted to die. I saw no point in continuing my studies, no reason to build a life that would always have that empty space where she should have been. But then something happened." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains. "A week after the miscarriage, I was volunteering at the children's ward to earn money for textbooks. There was a little girl, maybe 4 years old, with a congenital heart defect. Her parents couldn't afford surgery, and she was dying. Fatima turned back to Omar, her face illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window. I watched her struggle to breathe, watched her parents' helpless anguish, and I realized that while I couldn't save Amira, maybe I could save other people's daughters. Maybe I could prevent other families from experiencing the loss I had endured. So you became a cardiac surgeon. I became a weapon against death, Fatima corrected. Every child I save, every parent I spare from burying their baby, every technique I developed that makes the impossible surgery possible, it's all for her. For Amira, Omar absorbed this revelation, understanding finally the true source of Fatima's legendary dedication. She wasn't just a surgeon, she was a mother channeling her maternal love toward children she would never meet, families she would never know, futures she would help make possible. I need to tell you something, Omar said, his voice rough with emotion. This afternoon I liquidated 30% of my business empire, arms manufacturing, destructive mining operations, anything that causes more harm than good. Fatima looked surprised. Why? Because talking to the directors of your medical charities made me realize that while you've been saving the world one heart at a time, I've been destroying it one deal at a time. I want to change that. He reached for his phone, pulling up the financial documents his assistant had sent. $3.7 billion, Fatima. I want to establish a foundation in Amira's name, dedicated to pediatric cardiac care in underserved regions. I want to build hospitals, train surgeons, fund research. I want to turn my money into the kind of legacy you've already built with your hands and your heart. Fatima stared at him, clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. Omar, you can't just... I can't bring back our daughter, Omar interrupted, but I can honor her memory. I can ensure that her legacy lives on through the children we saved together. Not to earn your forgiveness, I know I don't deserve that, but because it's the right thing to do. The silence that followed was different from their previous conversations. It wasn't filled with tension or pain, but with possibility. For the first time in 30 years, they were discussing a shared future rather than a divided past. There would have to be conditions, Fatima said slowly, her medical mind already working through the practical implications. Complete transparency, oversight by medical professionals, focus on sustainable long-term impact rather than publicity. Whatever you think is best, Omar agreed. This isn't about my reputation or my legacy. This is about Amira's. Fatima returned to her chair, studying Omar with new eyes. You've changed, she said finally. The man I married would never have given up wealth for principle. The man you married was too young and too afraid to understand what really mattered, Omar replied. It took 30 years and a heart attack to realize that all the money in the world can't buy back the people you love or the time you've wasted. She was quiet for a long moment, then asked, What do you want from me, Omar? What do you expect? This foundation to accomplish between us? Nothing, Omar said honestly. I don't expect forgiveness, reconciliation, or a second chance. I expect to spend whatever years I have left trying to balance the scales, trying to create something good from the wreckage of my choices. If you're willing to help guide that effort, then Amira's legacy will be in the hands of someone who truly understands her value. Fatima stood to leave, then paused at the door. I'll consider it, she said quietly. Not for you and not for us, but for all the children who might live because of what we could build together. After she left, Omar lay in the darkness of his hospital room, watching the stars emerge over the alpine peaks. For the first time in 30 years, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope, not for personal redemption, that was beyond his reach, but for the possibility that his remaining years might matter for reasons that had nothing to do with profit margins or market dominance. Tomorrow would bring more conversations, more planning, more difficult decisions about how to transform a lifetime of accumulation into a legacy of healing. But tonight, Omar Rashid allowed himself to imagine a world where his daughter's name would be associated not with loss and abandonment, but with life and hope for thousands of children who would grow up healthy because of the foundation built in her memory. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't redemption. But perhaps, Omar thought as sleep finally claimed him, it was something even more valuable: purpose. 3 weeks into his recovery, Omar found himself in an unexpected setting: the basement conference room of Clinique Mont-Blanc, surrounded by medical professionals, charity directors, and financial advisors who had flown in from around the world. What had begun as a simple conversation about establishing a foundation had evolved into something far more ambitious: a comprehensive reimagining of how medical charity could operate in the modern world. Dr. Fatima Okafor sat at the head of the conference table, no longer his former wife or even his surgeon, but the undisputed expert whose vision would shape everything they were building. She had spent the past 2 weeks conducting due diligence that impressed even Omar's most skeptical financial advisors, creating detailed proposals that demonstrated both her medical expertise and a business acumen he had never known she possessed. The traditional model of medical charity is fundamentally flawed, Fatima explained to the assembled group, her presentation displaying charts and data that told a story of systemic healthcare failures across developing nations. We perform episodic interventions, fly in, operate leave, without building sustainable local capacity. Omar watched her command the room with the same authority she had once wielded in the operating theatre. This was Fatima, not as the broken woman he had abandoned, but as the global leader she had become, someone whose influence extended far beyond any single hospital or country. The Amira Foundation will be different, she continued, clicking to the next slide. Instead of creating dependency, we'll build independence. Instead of treating symptoms, we'll address systemic causes. Instead of counting procedures, we'll measure lives transformed across generations. Dr. James Morrison from the World Health Organization leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Dr. Okafor, the scope you're describing would require unprecedented coordination and funding. Most medical charities operate with budgets in the millions, not billions, which is precisely why most medical charities fail to create lasting change, Fatima replied without hesitation. Mr. Rashid's financial commitment allows us to think differently, to plan in decades rather than fiscal years. She gestured to Omar, who still felt strange being included in conversations where he contributed money, but deferred expertise to someone whose knowledge far exceeded his own. We're proposing a 10-year, multi-billion-dollar initiative that will establish cardiac surgery centers in 12 countries, train over 500 local surgeons, and create sustainable healthcare infrastructure that will serve these communities long after our direct involvement ends. The room buzzed with excitement and skepticism in equal measure. Omar found himself remembering boardrooms where he had proposed acquisitions or mergers worth similar amounts. But this felt different. Those deals had been about accumulation, adding assets to his portfolio, expanding his influence, increasing his wealth. This was about distribution, giving away resources to create something larger than the sum of its parts. The first phase will focus on East Africa, Fatima continued, her voice carrying the passion that had driven her through decades of healing work. We'll establish 3 major cardiac centers in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, each equipped with the most advanced technology available. But technology is only part of the solution. She clicked to a slide showing training curricula and fellowship programs. Simultaneously, we'll bring 40 local medical students to Switzerland and the United States for intensive cardiac surgery training. They'll spend 2 years learning not just surgical techniques, but hospital management, research, methodology, and training protocols so they can educate the next generation of local surgeons. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had assisted in Omar's surgery, raised her hand. Dr. Okafor, the logistics alone would be staggering. Housing, visas, living expenses for 40 international fellows, plus the infrastructure development you're describing. Which is why we're not rushing, Fatima replied. The foundation will be structured with sufficient capital to support operations for at least 15 years without requiring additional fundraising. Mr. Rashid has committed to providing the entire initial endowment up front, with additional funding triggers based on measurable outcomes. Omar's financial advisor, David Sterling, consulted his notes. The initial commitment is $4.2 billion, with potential additional funding of up to $2 billion more based on performance metrics. This represents the largest private medical charity endowment in history. The magnitude of those numbers still surprised Omar, even though he had approved them. In his previous life, $4 billion would have been leverage for acquiring more wealth. Now it represented the transformation of capital into compassion, profit into purpose. But this isn't just about the money, Fatima said, her eyes meeting Omar's across the table. It's about fundamentally changing how we approach global health disparities. Every dollar spent will be tracked, every outcome measured, every decision made with the singular goal of maximizing lives saved per unit of investment. She pulled up a detailed financial model that showed projected costs and outcomes over the foundation's first decade. We estimate that this investment will directly save approximately 35,000 children's lives and create sustainable healthcare infrastructure that will save an additional 150,000 lives. Beyond our direct involvement, the room fell silent as the implications of those projections settled over the assembled group. Omar found himself thinking about Amira, wondering what she might have accomplished if she had lived, and feeling a strange sense of completion at the thought that her legacy would be measured in lives that would otherwise have been lost. Dr. Elena Vasquez from Barcelona spoke up. Dr. Okafor, I've reviewed your proposed governance structure. You're essentially creating a hybrid model, part medical charity, part academic institution, part technology development company. The complexity is extraordinary. So is the problem. We're trying to solve, Fatima replied. Traditional approaches have failed because they're too narrow, too limited in scope and ambition. If we're going to create lasting change, we need to think systemically. She advanced to a slide showing organizational charts. The foundation will have 3 primary divisions: direct care, education and training, and research and development. Each division will be led by world-class professionals and held to the highest standards of both medical excellence and financial accountability. Omar watched the faces around the table, seeing excitement building among the medical professionals and careful calculation among the financial advisors. This was the moment when ambitious vision collided with practical reality, when dreams were either transformed into actionable plans or dissolved under the weight of logistical complexity. I have one question, said Dr. Morrison from the WHO. Dr. Okafor, your personal involvement in this foundation represents a significant commitment of time and energy. You're currently one of the most sought-after cardiac surgeons in the world, with a full practice and existing charitable commitments. How do you plan to manage these competing demands? Fatima was quiet for a moment, and Omar sensed that this question cut to the heart of decisions she had been wrestling with privately. Dr. Morrison, I'm 57 years old. I've performed over 4,000 cardiac surgeries, trained hundreds of surgeons, published extensively in peer-reviewed journals. My direct clinical impact has been significant, but it's also been limited by the fact that I can only be in one operating room at a time. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Swiss mountains. The Amira Foundation represents an opportunity to scale that impact exponentially. Instead of saving individual lives, I can help build systems that save thousands of lives. Instead of training individual surgeons, I can help create institutions that train entire generations of medical professionals. She turned back to face the room. I'm not abandoning clinical practice entirely, but I am prepared to restructure my career around this foundation's mission. This is how I choose to spend the remaining productive years of my professional life. Omar felt a profound sense of admiration for her commitment, coupled with the painful awareness that her dedication to this cause was rooted in a loss they had shared, but that she had borne alone. Every life the foundation saved would be, in some sense, a memorial to the daughter who had died because of his abandonment. David Sterling raised his hand. If I may address the financial structure, Mr. Rashid has proposed something unusual. Rather than the traditional model of annual charitable giving, he's creating an irrevocable trust that will transfer ownership of specific business assets directly to the foundation. This means the foundation will own revenue-generating properties and businesses, creating a sustainable funding model that doesn't depend on continued donations. Dr. Chen looked surprised. So, the foundation will be financially self-sustaining? More than self-sustaining, Sterling replied. The business assets being transferred generate approximately $300 million annually in revenue. After operating expenses, the foundation will have roughly $200 million per year in perpetuity for charitable work, with the principal endowment remaining intact for major infrastructure investments. The room buzzed with conversation as the implications of this funding model became clear. Omar had essentially created a charitable empire that would outlive him by centuries, generating resources for medical care long after everyone in this room had died. There's one more element, Fatima said, regaining the room's attention. The foundation will also fund research into medical technologies specifically designed for resource-limited settings. We're not just bringing existing solutions to underserved populations. We're developing new solutions tailored to their specific needs and constraints. She clicked to a slide showing prototype medical devices, simplified cardiac surgery equipment that can operate without reliable electricity, surgical training simulators that can be manufactured locally, telemedicine platforms that connect rural hospitals with specialist expertise. The foundation will hold patents on these technologies, but license them freely to non-profit organizations worldwide. Omar realized that Fatima had spent the past 3 weeks not just planning a charity, but designing a comprehensive ecosystem for global health improvement that would regenerate and expand its impact across decades. She had taken his money and transformed it into something he could never have imagined, a living memorial to their daughter that would save children for generations to come. As the meeting concluded and participants began making plans for the next phase of development, Omar found himself alone with Fatima in the conference room. The sun was setting over the Alps, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. "This is extraordinary," Omar said quietly. "What you've designed, the scope of it, the sophistication, it's beyond anything I could have conceived." Fatima gathered her materials, her movements efficient and purposeful. "It's what Amira would have wanted," she said simply. "If she had lived, if she had become a doctor like her mother, this is the kind of work she would have done." Omar felt tears forming in his eyes. "How do you do it? How do you channel loss into something so constructive?" Fatima paused in her packing, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Because the alternative is letting that loss be meaningless. because somewhere in the world tonight, there's a 4-year-old girl struggling to breathe because of a heart defect her parents can't afford to fix. And when we save her life, when she grows up and becomes a teacher or a mother or a leader in her community, then Amira's death will have meant something. She moved toward the door, then stopped. The foundation board meets next month in Nairobi to finalize the first construction projects. If you're serious about this commitment, you should be there. I'll be there, Omar promised. As Fatima left the room, Omar remained standing by the window, watching the stars emerge over the alpine peaks. For the first time in 30 years, he felt like he was building something that would matter long after he was gone. Not a business empire that would be divided among heirs and competitors, but a legacy of healing that would carry his daughter's name into a future filled with children who would live because of choices he and Fatima were making. Today, the bridge they were building between past and future, between loss and hope, between two people who had loved and lost and finally found a way to transform their shared pain into shared purpose. 6 months after his heart surgery, Omar Rashid stood in the red dust of a construction site in Nairobi, Kenya, watching bulldozers break ground for what would become the first Amira Foundation Cardiac Center. The contrast could not have been more striking, from the sterile luxury of a Swiss clinic to the controlled chaos of urban Africa, where the sounds of construction equipment mixed with the calls of street vendors and the laughter of children playing in nearby schools. He wore simple khaki work clothes instead of his usual tailored suits, his skin bronzed from months of travel to project sites across East Africa. The heart surgery had left him physically diminished, but somehow more present in the world, as if surviving death had taught him how to truly live. "The foundation will be poured next week," reported James Kibera, the Kenyan architect overseeing the construction. Dr. Okafor's specifications are quite detailed. She's thought of everything from backup power systems to specialized air filtration for the operating theaters. Omar nodded, studying the architectural plans spread across a makeshift table. Fatima had indeed thought of everything, designing a facility that would rival the best cardiac centers in Europe while remaining practical for the African context. Solar panels would provide primary power, with diesel generators as backup. Water purification systems would ensure sterile conditions even during municipal supply interruptions. The building itself was designed to expand as the program grew, with foundations already planned for future wings that would house research laboratories and training facilities. "Mr. Rashid," called a voice behind him. Omar turned to see Dr. Amani Wanjiku, a young Kenyan cardiac surgeon who had been selected as one of the first Amira Foundation Fellows. She had spent the past 4 months training in Switzerland with Fatima and was now returning home to help establish the new center. "Dr. Wanjiku," Omar smiled, genuinely pleased to see her. "How was your flight from Zurich?" "Long but productive," she replied, her eyes bright with excitement. Dr. Okafor sent detailed protocols for the equipment installation. She wants everything tested and retested before the first patient arrives. Omar had come to deeply respect these young doctors who had accepted fellowships with the foundation. They were brilliant, dedicated, and carried themselves with a sense of purpose that reminded him of Fatima in her younger years. Dr. Wanjiku, in particular, had impressed everyone with her surgical skill and her vision for what cardiac care could become in East Africa. "Dr. Okafor will be here next week for the equipment installation," Omar said. "She's bringing the first surgical team from Switzerland to begin training the local staff." "And the first patients?" Dr. Wanjiku asked. 47 children are already on the waiting list," Omar replied, consulting his tablet. "Ages ranging from 6 months to 16 years, all with congenital heart defects that are operable with the right equipment and expertise." The weight of those numbers never left him. 47 children whose lives hung in the balance, 47 families who had never dared hope that surgery might be possible, 47 futures that would be determined by the success or failure of what they were building here. Omar's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from David Sterling in London. Swiss bank transfer complete. Nairobi Centre fully funded through operational launch. Kampala site permits approved. Dar es Salaam land. Acquisition finalized. The machine is working. The machine. That's what his financial team had begun calling the Foundation's operations, a complex network of funding, construction, training, and logistics that was simultaneously building cardiac centers in 3 countries, while training dozens of surgeons and developing new medical technologies. It was more ambitious than any business venture Omar had ever undertaken, and infinitely more meaningful. "Mr. Rashid," Dr. Wanjiku said quietly, "may I ask you something personal?" Omar nodded, having learned that these conversations often provided insights that boardroom presentations couldn't match. The workers here, the local community, they don't understand why a wealthy Arab businessman would spend billions of dollars to save African children. They're grateful, but they're also suspicious. They want to know what you're really getting out of this. The question didn't surprise Omar. He had faced similar skepticism at every project site, from community leaders who assumed hidden motives to government officials who expected traditional quid pro quo arrangements. The concept of genuine philanthropy, without political or economic strings attached, was foreign in regions where aid often came with conditions. "What do you tell them?" Omar asked. "I tell them about Amira," Dr. Wanjiku replied. "I explain that sometimes loss can be transformed into love, that sometimes the deepest grief can become the strongest force for healing. But I think they would understand better if they heard it from you." Omar considered this. He had deliberately kept a low profile during the Foundation's development, allowing Fatima to be the public face, while he worked behind the scenes on logistics and funding. But perhaps Dr. Wanjiku was right. Perhaps the community deserved to understand the personal motivations driving this unprecedented investment in their children's health. That evening, Omar found himself in an unexpected setting, a community meeting, in a local school, facing about 60 parents whose children were on the surgical waiting list. The room was crowded, warm, filled with faces that carried the particular mixture of hope and desperation that he had learned to recognize in families dealing with childhood cardiac conditions. Dr. Wanjiku had arranged for translation, but Omar insisted on speaking in Swahili, a language he had been studying intensively for the past 6 months. His pronunciation was imperfect, but the effort to communicate in their language clearly moved the assembled parents. "My name is Omar Rashid," he began, his voice carrying more emotion than he had intended. 30 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. I abandoned my pregnant wife because my family told me that love was less important than tradition, that happiness was less valuable than reputation." He paused, looking around the room at faces that had grown attentive, some showing recognition of universal themes of family conflict and difficult choices. "My wife was carrying our daughter, whom we would have named Amira. Because of my abandonment, because my wife was left alone without support, we lost our child. She died before she could be born, before she could live, before she could become the doctor her mother dreamed she would be." The room was completely silent now. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of what was being shared. For 30 years, I built wealth and power, telling myself that my choice had been practical, rational, necessary. But 6 months ago, I nearly died, and the surgeon who saved my life was the woman I had abandoned. Dr. Fatima Okafor had become one of the world's greatest cardiac surgeons, saving thousands of children's lives while I accumulated money that meant nothing. Omar's voice grew stronger as he continued. The Amira Foundation exists because our daughter cannot. Every child we save, every surgeon we train, every hospital we build, it is our way of honoring the life that was lost and ensuring that other families do not suffer the same loss. A woman in the front row raised her hand. When Omar nodded, she spoke in accented English. Mr. Rashid, my daughter Zara has been waiting 2 years for heart surgery. The doctors in Nairobi said it was too complex, too expensive. When Dr. Wanjiku told us about your foundation, I thought it was too good to be true. Rich people don't usually help poor people without wanting something. What I want, Omar replied, is for Zara to grow up healthy, to go to school, to become whatever she dreams of becoming. What I want is for you to never experience the loss that Dr. Okafor and I have carried for 30 years. What I want is for Amira's legacy to be measured in lives lived rather than life lost. Another parent spoke up, an older man whose grandson was also on the waiting list. Dr. Okafor, we have heard of her. She is famous even here, known for her skill and her heart. But you, Mr. Rashid, what do you know about saving children? You are a businessman, not a doctor. The question was fair, and Omar had asked it of himself many times. You're right. I know nothing about surgery, nothing about medicine, but I know about systems, about logistics, about making complex projects work across multiple countries and cultures. Dr. Okafor has the medical expertise. I have the resources and organizational experience. Together, we can build something neither of us could create alone. The meeting continued for over 2 hours, with parents asking detailed questions about the surgical procedures, the timeline for opening the center, the selection criteria for patients. Omar found himself deeply moved by their hope and their trust, by their willingness to believe that strangers from distant countries would keep promises about their children's health. As the meeting concluded and families began to leave, Dr. Wanjiku approached Omar with a young woman and a small girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Mr. Rashid, Dr. Wanjiku said, I'd like you to meet Grace Nyong'o and her daughter Amira. Omar felt his breath catch. The child's name, the same name he and Fatima had chosen for their lost daughter, seemed impossibly significant. Amira will be our first patient when the center opens, Dr. Wanjiku continued. Tetralogy of Fallot, quite complex, but Dr. Okafor has reviewed her case and believes the surgery will be successful. Omar knelt down to the child's level, struck by her bright eyes and shy smile. She was exactly the age his own Amira would have been when she died, and for a moment the grief he thought he had processed threatened to overwhelm him. Hello, Amira, he said softly in Swahili. We're going to take very good care of you. The little girl smiled and reached out to touch his face, a gesture so innocent and trusting that Omar felt tears forming in his eyes. Here was the future. The foundation was fighting for, not abstract statistics or impressive medical outcomes, but individual children who would live full lives because of the choices he and Fatima were making together. Later that evening, as Omar sat in his modest hotel room overlooking the Nairobi skyline, he video-called Fatima in Zurich. She appeared on screen wearing scrubs, having just completed a surgery. How did the community meeting go? She asked, her face showing the fatigue that came from a long day in the operating room. Difficult but important, Omar replied. They needed to understand why we're doing this, needed to trust that our motives are genuine. And do they trust us now? Omar thought about little Amira's bright eyes, about the parents who had stayed after the meeting to share their stories, about the hope he had seen in faces that had known too much disappointment. I think so, he said. I think they understand that this isn't about us anymore. It's about their children, their future, their hope. Fatima nodded, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the video connection. Two people who had been strangers, then lovers, then enemies, and now something new. Partners in a mission larger than their personal history. The surgeries begin in 3 weeks, Fatima said. Are you ready for this to become real? Omar looked out at the lights of Nairobi, thinking about the construction site where workers would return tomorrow to continue building their daughter's memorial, thinking about the 47 children whose lives would soon be in Fatima's skilled hands. I've been ready for 30 years, he said. I just didn't know it until now. 1 year after breaking ground in Nairobi, Omar stood in the observation gallery of the Amira Foundation Cardiac Center, watching Dr. Fatima Okafor perform surgery on their namesake patient, 4-year-old Amira Nyong'o. The operating theater below was a symphony of controlled precision, with Fatima leading a team that included Dr. Wanjiku and 2 other Kenyan surgeons who had completed their foundation fellowships. The irony was not lost on Omar that he was once again watching Fatima save a life, but this time the patient was a child who would grow up because of choices they had made together rather than despite the choices he had made alone. Tetralogy of Fallot repair proceeding normally. Fatima's voice came through the intercom system, calm and professional despite the complexity of the 4-hour procedure. Dr. Wanjiku, would you like to close the ventricular septal defect? Omar felt a surge of pride watching the young Kenyan surgeon step forward to complete a critical portion of the surgery. This was exactly what they had envisioned. Local doctors gaining the expertise to perform life-saving procedures independently, reducing dependence on foreign intervention while building sustainable healthcare capacity. Beside him in the observation gallery stood representatives from 12 different countries, all observing the Foundation's methods as they planned similar cardiac centers in their own regions. What had begun as a memorial to one lost child had evolved into a global movement that was reshaping pediatric cardiac care across the developing world. Mr. Rashid, said Dr. Helena Santos from São Paulo, the Brazilian Ministry of Health is prepared to co-fund 3 cardiac centers based on your Nairobi model. Our initial commitment would be $50 million, with the understanding that the Amira Foundation would provide technical expertise and training protocols. Omar nodded, making notes on his tablet. In the past year, the Foundation had received funding requests totaling over $2 billion from governments and NGOs worldwide, all seeking to replicate the success they were witnessing in East Africa. The challenge was no longer raising money. It was scaling their impact while maintaining the quality standards that made their approach effective. Dr. Santos, I'll have our development team send you the full implementation package next week, Omar replied. But I want to emphasize that funding is only 30% of what makes this work. The real key is finding local medical leaders with Dr. Wanjiku's combination of surgical skill and community commitment. Through the observation window, Omar watched Fatima guide her Kenyan colleagues through the delicate process of reconstructing little Amira's heart. The child's vital signs remained stable, her body responding well to the surgical intervention that would give her a normal life expectancy and the ability to run, play, and dream without the limitations imposed by her congenital defect. Patch placement complete, Dr. Wanjiku announced, her voice steady with concentration. Blood flow appears normal through the repaired pathways. Excellent work, Fatima replied, and Omar could hear the pride in her voice. Dr. Mwangi, would you like to begin closure? The third surgeon, Dr. David Mwangi, stepped forward to close the child's chest. Like Dr. Wanjiku, he had completed an intensive fellowship program that combined surgical training with hospital management, research methodology, and community outreach. The Foundation's approach required doctors to be not just skilled surgeons, but also healthcare system builders who could adapt advanced techniques to local contexts. Omar's phone buzzed with a message from David Sterling in London. Quarterly report complete. 347 surgeries performed across 3 centres, 98.6% success rate, 42 local surgeons trained, 0 patient mortalities in past 6 months. The model is working beyond our most optimistic projections. The statistics represented more than just successful outcomes. They represented a fundamental shift in how global health challenges could be addressed. Instead of temporary interventions that provided short-term relief, the foundation had created permanent infrastructure that would continue saving lives for generations. Mr. Rashid called Dr. James Morrison from the WHO, who had flown in from Geneva specifically to observe this surgery. I wanted to discuss the Foundation's research division. The surgical simulation technology you've developed is revolutionary. Omar smiled, remembering his initial skepticism when Fatima had proposed dedicating 20% of their budget to developing new medical technologies. Dr. Okafor insisted that we couldn't just transplant Western solutions to African contexts. We needed to innovate specifically for resource-limited settings. He led Dr. Morrison to a nearby room where the Foundation's latest innovation was being demonstrated. A cardiac surgery simulator that could operate without reliable electricity, using locally manufactured components that cost 90% less than traditional training equipment. The device allowed surgeons to practice complex procedures repeatedly before operating on actual patients, dramatically reducing the learning curve for difficult surgeries. We've already installed these simulators in medical schools across 12 countries, Omar explained. The technology is open source, so any institution can manufacture and modify the units to meet their specific needs. Dr. Morrison examined the simulator with obvious admiration. This represents exactly the kind of innovation we need for global health equity. How quickly could you scale production? Our manufacturing partners in India and Kenya are already producing units for distribution throughout Africa and Southeast Asia, Omar replied. By next year, we expect over 200 medical schools to have access to this technology. Through the observation window, Omar saw Fatima beginning the final stages of little Amira's surgery. The child's chest was being closed, her heart rhythm strong and regular on the monitors. In a few hours, she would wake up with a fully functional heart, ready to begin a life free from the limitations that had defined her first 4 years. Surgery complete, Fatima announced to the observing audience. Patient stable, excellent hemodynamics, successful repair of all 4 cardiac defects. Dr. Wanjiku and Dr. Mwangi, outstanding work. The observation gallery erupted in applause, not just for the successful surgery, but for what it represented. Local surgeons performing complex procedures independently, using equipment designed specifically for their context in a facility that would continue operating long after foreign experts departed. As little Amira was wheeled to recovery, Omar felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Fatima beside him, still in her surgical scrubs, her face showing the exhaustion and satisfaction that followed every successful operation. "How does it feel?" she asked quietly. "Watching our daughter's legacy save another child's life." Omar was quiet for a moment, watching the recovery team settle little Amira into the pediatric ICU, where she would be monitored by nurses trained specifically in post-operative cardiac care. "It feels like completion," he said finally. "Not redemption, I'll never deserve that, but completion." Fatima nodded, understanding the distinction. They had built something together that honored their lost child without pretending to undo the damage of past choices. They had transformed grief into healing, loss into hope, personal failure into global impact. "Dr. Okafor," called Dr. Wanjiku, approaching them with obvious excitement. "I wanted to let you know, little Amira wasn't our only success story today. We also received confirmation that all 23 children from our first month of operations are doing well. Normal activity levels, regular school attendance, no complications." The news hit Omar with unexpected emotional force. 23. Children who were alive and healthy because of decisions he and Fatima had made in a Swiss hospital room 18 months ago. 23 families who would never experience the loss that had shaped both their lives. "And there's more," Dr. Wanjiku continued. "The Ministry of Health has approved our proposal for the Pediatric Cardiac Training Institute. Starting next year, we'll be able to train 40 surgeons annually right here in Nairobi, eliminating the need for overseas fellowships." Omar felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The foundation was achieving exactly what they had envisioned: sustainable, scalable impact that would continue growing even without their direct involvement. They had created not just hospitals, but educational institutions, not just medical procedures, but manufacturing capabilities, not just temporary aid, but permanent infrastructure. That evening, Omar and Fatima found themselves alone in the hospital cafeteria, sharing a simple dinner of ugali and sukuma wiki, local foods that had become familiar during their frequent visits to Nairobi. The contrast with the luxury they both could afford was deliberate. They had learned that understanding the communities they served required experiencing life from their perspective. "I've been thinking," Fatima said, stirring her tea thoughtfully, "about what comes next for us personally." Omar looked up, uncertain what she meant. "The foundation will continue growing," she continued. "We have brilliant local leaders like Dr. Wanjiku who understand the medical mission better than we ever could. Our role is becoming less essential with each passing month." "That was always the plan," Omar agreed. "Build something sustainable that doesn't depend on us." "But what about us?" Fatima asked, her voice carrying a vulnerability he hadn't heard since their confrontation in the Swiss hospital. "We've spent the past year working together, building something meaningful, honoring our daughter's memory. But we've never discussed what that means for our relationship." Omar set down his fork, recognizing that they had arrived at a conversation he had been both anticipating and dreading. Over the past year, working alongside Fatima had reminded him of everything he had admired about her 3 decades ago, while also revealing depths of character and competence that she had developed. In their years apart, "I don't expect forgiveness," Omar said carefully, "and I certainly don't expect reconciliation. What I hope for is that we can continue being partners in this work, that the foundation can be a bridge between us, even if nothing else is possible." Fatima was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the Nairobi skyline, where lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "Omar, for 30 years I convinced myself that I hated you. It was easier than admitting that I still loved the man you could have been, still grieved the life we might have had together." She turned back to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Working with you this past year, seeing you transform from someone who accumulated wealth into someone who distributes healing, it's shown me that the man I loved was always there, just buried under layers of fear and family pressure." Omar felt his heart racing, uncertain where this conversation was leading. "I can't pretend the past didn't happen," Fatima continued. "I can't pretend that losing Amira didn't change me in fundamental ways, that your abandonment didn't shape every relationship I've had since, but I can choose what I do with the future." She reached across the table and took his hand, a gesture that carried the weight of 3 decades of separation and 18 months of gradual healing. "The Amira Foundation will always be our most important work together," she said. "But maybe it doesn't have to be our only work together." Omar squeezed her hand gently, feeling tears forming in his eyes. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" I'm saying that love can be rebuilt, that trust can be regained, that two people who lost each other can find their way back if they're willing to do the work. Fatima smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he had seen from her since their reunion. I'm saying that maybe our daughter's legacy can include not just the children we save, but the love we recover. Outside the hospital cafeteria, the sounds of Nairobi at night provided a soundtrack of life continuing. Vendors calling their wares, children playing, families gathering for evening meals. Inside, two people who had lost everything began to imagine what they might build together with whatever time remained. The Amira Foundation would continue its work, saving thousands of lives across dozens of countries. But for Omar and Fatima, the most important healing was just beginning. Not the restoration of what had been lost, but the creation of something entirely new, built on the foundation of shared purpose and hard-won wisdom. Sometimes, Omar reflected, as they walked hand in hand through the hospital corridors where their daughter's name adorned the walls, the greatest victories come not from avoiding failure, but from transforming failure into something meaningful. Their love story had ended 30 years ago in abandonment and loss, but their healing story, for themselves, for their daughter's memory, and for thousands of children around the world, was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.